Today's video is more or less all about triads. Taking all we've learned through the last 3 episodes, we're going to look at triads from a few new perspectives today. First, we'll examine the full group of diatonic triads, a special group of triads built off of each note of the major scale. From there, we'll learn how to alter triads through inversion, adding depth and complexity to the triads we've been studying. And finally, we're going to get familiar with some common harmonic progressions with a close look at cadences. It's a full day of triads, so let's get right into it. Grab your textbook, dial in your focus, and let's get into the good stuff. Right. Like I said in the intro, today's video is triads through and through. And we're starting off with diatonic triads. We've already studied some of these triads to some degree back in our introduction to major triads. You'll recall that diatonic is how we describe musical elements that only use the 7 pitches within a key signature. And the opposite of that is chromaticism or chromatic, which is used to describe all of the notes outside of our key. To set the stage for diatonic triads, let's lay out a major scale and include its matching key signature. From here, let's build a triad on each scale degree by stacking thirds and only using the notes from the key. When we build triads like this, using the scale degrees as root notes and staying within the key, we end up with a special group of chords that we call diatonic triads. Think about how important the major scale is when it came to writing melodies last semester. Well, these 7 diatonic triads are going to be equally important this time around as we learn to write our own harmonic progressions. What's the first thing that we want to do with these diatonic triads? You guessed it, we want to analyze them. We want to find out which of these diatonic triads are major, which are minor, and which, if any, are either augmented or diminished. So we go through them chord by chord and interval by interval, learning the composition of each diatonic triad and labeling them appropriately. After labeling the 7th and final chord, we can step back and see the results. As it turns out, there are 3 major triads, which we already knew. There are 3 minor triads, which is new information. And there's just 1 diminished triad. Now, interestingly, there's not one single instance of an augmented triad in our diatonic chords here. That's something to take note of. Our diatonic major triads appear on scale degrees 1, 4, and 5, or do, fa, sol. The diatonic minor triads appear on scale degrees 2, 3, and 6, or re, mi, and la. And the lone wolf, our diatonic diminished triad, appears on scale degree 7, or T. As an aside, we often call scale degree 7 the leading tone, since it has such a strong tendency to lead us back to scale degree 1 by half-step motion. Likewise, you may sometimes hear the diminished triad referred to as a leading tone chord. Okay, our first step in analyzing these triads is complete. The next thing we want to do is label these diatonic triads using Roman numeral analysis. Remember that Roman numerals are a labeling system used in Western music to convey 2 specific pieces of information about each chord. One, which scale degree is being used as the root pitch, and 2, which triad type is being built upon that root. When it comes to the major triads, we label them by writing their scale degrees as uppercase or capitalized Roman numerals. For the minor triads, we label them instead with lowercase Roman numerals. And for the diminished triad, we also use a lowercase Roman numeral, but we add a small circle to the upper right of that number. For the sake of being thorough, an augmented triad would be labeled with an uppercase Roman numeral followed by a plus sign, although it doesn't appear anywhere in this group. Now, I don't want to get bogged down here in the diatonic triads world, especially since we have some other really interesting topics ahead still in this video. So I'm going to stick a pin in this for now. But from this point forward, you should know the triad type of each diatonic triad, and you should be able to label them with the appropriate Roman numerals. If you're feeling comfortable with that, let's push on. We introduced inversions all the way back during our study of intervals, when our study of harmony was still limited to only 2 pitches. We learned back then that an inversion is simply an interval flipped upside down, which we typically accomplished by taking the lower note and transposing it up 1 octave so that it then was the higher note. As an example, the perfect fifth created between D natural and A natural, where D is the lower pitch, well, let's simply raise that lower note by an octave, so now we're looking at the inversion, A to D, which is a perfect fourth. Through inversion, we've kept each pitch class the same, but we've changed their positions relative to one another, and in doing so, we created a new interval. Now, you might be thinking, thank you for the review, but we're studying triads now. And I'm here to tell you, triads can be inverted too, and it's a wonderful thing. Up until now, we've been building and studying triads in what we call root position, which just means that the root pitch of the triad is also the lowest sounding note of the triad, or the bass note. Here's a C major triad in root position, made from the pitches C, E, and G from bottom to top. You'll notice its familiar snowman shape that we've been using to build triads. As expected for root position, the root pitch C is the lowest note in the triad. Let's listen to a C major triad in root position. We can also label this harmony with the chord symbol C and a capital M, or simply C, which implies that it's major. Now, let's invert this triad. Just like we did when we inverted an interval, I'm just going to invert this triad by taking the lowest note, which happens to be the root, and moving it up an octave. So it then becomes the highest note in the triad. Well, now the pitches in our triad, from lowest to highest, are E, G, C. And the third of the chord is now the lowest sounding pitch. We call this position the first inversion. The first inversion of a triad always has the third of the chord at the bottom. Again, let's listen to a C major triad, but this time in its first inversion. We label this chord with C/E, which tells us that we have a C major chord, but the lowest sounding note is E. This chord symbol is often referred to as a slash chord. With intervals, we only had one inversion. That's because if we invert our interval a second time, we just end up back where we started with the original position. But triads have 3 notes, so we also have 3 positions. So let's take our first inversion C major triad and once again take the lowest note and transpose it up an octave. Well, now the pitches from lowest to highest are G, C, E. And the 5th of the chord is now the lowest sounding note. This position is called second inversion. The second inversion of a triad always has the 5th of the chord on the bottom. Once again, let's listen to a C major triad, but now in second inversion. Once again, we'll label this chord using a slash chord, but this time it'll be C/G. For all the similarities between inverting intervals and inverting triads, there is an important difference between the two. With intervals, an inversion always ends up creating a different interval in terms of both size and quality. An augmented 4th when inverted becomes a diminished 5th, and a major 2nd when inverted becomes a minor 7th. But when it comes to triads, that's not really the case any longer. A major triad, whether in root position, first inversion, or second inversion, is still a major triad. I like to think of this as gazing at a painting from 3 different angles. Sure, it's the same paint on the same canvas, no matter where you look at it. But depending on where you stand, your position, the impression of the painting upon you will change. Now, before we move on, we really need to establish how we're going to identify and label these inverted triads whenever we encounter them out in the wild. As is so often the case in this series, we have a pretty easy to memorize 3-step process to accomplish this goal. Let's use this inverted triad to walk us through each step and see if we can figure out what chord we're looking at and what position it's in. Step 1. Begin by rearranging the chord until you find it in root position, which you're going to recognize by the snowman shape that we've been using to build triads. Remember, there's only 3 positions for a triad possible, and we're starting with one of the inverted positions, so it should be a short little trial and error to get your chord into root position. Now, once you're there, it's step 2. From root position, you can now identify the root pitch of the chord because it's going to be the bottom note. And by measuring the intervals from pitch to pitch, we'll be able to tell whether this triad is major, minor, augmented, or diminished. So now we know the chord name, which we take from the root pitch, and we know the triad type. Step 3. All that's left to do is label the original chord using the right chord symbol and a slash to indicate the appropriate inversion. If you're following along in our textbook, which I hope you are, then I highly recommend opening up to chapter 15 and taking a moment to practice identifying and labeling these inverted triads that you'll find at the end of the chapter. After practicing just a handful, I bet you'll likely begin to recognize some of these inversions by sight. We're going to move on from inversions for now, but we'll revisit this topic in the very next video so that we can study how composers put inversions to use in their music. Let's also take a moment now to hit pause and have a stretch, drink some water, and eat a few orange slices. When you're ready to continue, we've got more knowledge on the other side of the break. On the second half of today's video, we're going to revisit a concept that we briefly touched upon in episode 8, or chapter 11 in the textbook. It's the concept of harmonic progression, which is quite simply a succession of two or more chords. In our introduction to major triads, we spent time studying the harmonic progression 1, 4, 5, 1. Well, we're older and wiser now, and with the addition of minor, diminished, and augmented triads, we're ready for a closer look at the rules and conventions that govern harmonic progressions. When it comes to writing music, I often like to say things like, "You can do anything," or "the possibilities are endless." But the truth of the matter is that in Western tonal music, you really can't follow a chord with just any other chord. To use a linguistic analogy, if we liken chords to the words in our vocabulary, then harmonic progressions are like sentences, and a well-formed sentence must follow the syntax of the language, or you risk sounding like nonsense. This same principle applies to us in our study of music. And now that we have a larger harmonic vocabulary, we need to learn about the tonal syntax of music. Let's begin with the most fundamental progression in tonal music, 5 to 1. Here, we see it in the key of D major, where our 5 chord is an A major triad, and our 1 chord is a D major triad. Have a listen. One of the most important things to consider when looking at a harmonic progression is the relationship between the root pitches of each chord. Here we see a progression with root motion of a 5th down, or a 4th up. And beyond any doubt, this is the most common type of progression in our music. In fact, just about any chord can be preceded by the chord a 5th above it. Let's add a chord to this progression. The root pitch for this new chord should be a 5th above our 5 chord, so in our key of D major, that means the root of our new chord is going to be E natural, or scale degree 2. Now, we do want to keep this harmonic progression squarely in the key of D major, or in other words, we want to stick to only diatonic pitches and triads. As we learned at the top of today's video, the diatonic triad that's built on scale degree 2 is always a minor triad. And in our key of D major, that means we're adding an E minor triad to the front of this progression, just in front of that A major chord. When we label this progression with Roman numerals, we have a minor 2, major 5, major 1, and make sure to use a lowercase symbol for that minor 2 chord. You can keep on adding chords like this just by using root motion in fifths and sticking with the diatonic triads. In fact, our textbook has us practice writing a slight variation on the minor 3, minor 6, minor 2, major 5, major 1 progression. You may also notice a familiar pattern starting to take shape here. Since these chord roots are linked by a progression of fifths, you'd be right to be reminded of our old friend, the circle of fifths. Now, when you go to practice the exercises in Chapter 14 and later in the chapter review, where you have to write this progression in several different keys, it'll make things a lot easier for you if you have a circle of fifths nearby to reference. Now, not all harmonic progressions use motion in fifths. In fact, if we only used fifths to connect our chords, the music would be predictable and uninteresting to the listener. Now, to avoid that, it's also common to find chords connected by root motion in seconds, such as 4 to 5 in our first progression that we learned, or also root motion in thirds, such as 1 down to 6, which you'll practice this week in Chapter 14. That said, we're going to stick primarily with root motion in fifths just for now. Before we bring it all to a close today, I want to pare back this progression just to that 2-5-1 that we started with. Harmonic function refers to the relationship of a chord with the other chords in the same key, and especially with respect to the one chord. These three harmonies encapsulate three different functions that a chord might play within a progression. And when these chords work together, they help to establish and define the key of the music. This three-chord progression is also what we call a cadence, which is the term we use to describe a musical point of arrival. In the previous video, we talked about musical phrases, and we defined them as self-sufficient musical statements that carry us from one tonal point to another. Well, how are we able to hear when we've reached that tonal goal of a phrase? Cadences achieve that for us because they provide a momentary rest in the music before a new phrase begins and propels us forward with renewed momentum. When we hear a cadence in the music, it's sort of like your GPS saying, you have arrived at your destination. Not every progression can function as a cadence. On the contrary, many progressions actually serve to create forward momentum in music. That's partially why a cadence stands out to our ears, and why it helps to articulate the end of a phrase so clearly. But what is it exactly about these three chords that make them such a suitable cadence? Let's look closer at each one. The one chord is called the tonic chord, and it's the central harmony in our tonal system. A phrase that begins on the tonic creates a sense of tonal center for the listener. And if a phrase ends on the tonic, it provides the listener with a sense of conclusion. Since the goal of our cadence is to establish an arrival point in the music, it makes sense that it should end with a one chord. The 5 chord is called the dominant chord, and this is the second most important harmony in our tonal system. A dominant chord serves to create tension in the music that is only resolved by progressing to the tonic. The tension in this harmony comes from the inclusion of scale degree 7 in the chord, also called the leading tone, because of its strong tendency to lead upward by half step to scale degree 1. Now lastly, this minor 2 chord is what we call a predominant chord. And as the name would suggest, it serves to prepare the dominant chord. Now, unlike a true dominant chord, there's no leading tone in a predominant chord, and so it lacks the same degree of tension that the dominant chord creates. Oftentimes, we can substitute chords from our 2-5-1 cadence with other chords that serve a similar function. For example, a 4 chord and a 2 chord share 2 notes in common, and that similarity allows us to write a 4-5-1 progression while still preserving many of the characteristics of our original cadence. In this context, our 4 chord is functioning as a predominant, though in a different context, that 4 chord might have a different function altogether. So why do we make such a big deal out of harmonic function? Well, when these 3 chord functions work together, they have the effect of unambiguously establishing and defining a key for the listener, and that is really important. After a listener hears the progression from predominant to dominant to tonic, there can be no mistake about where the tonal center lies. Imagine you want to make a key change in your music. Use a 2-5-1 in that new key to tell the listener, hey, we've moved to a new key and now we're going on. We can find 2-5-1 cadences in all sorts of musical styles, from Vivaldi to Gershwin, but arguably nowhere else is it more prevalent than in the popular songs and jazz standards of the Great American Songbook. So many of these songs are built around a series of 2-5-1 progressions, though they're often cleverly disguised using embellishment, substitution, or other techniques that we'll explore in the future. As a singer, understanding harmonic function can be a real boon to your performance in a couple of different ways. Comprehending whether a harmony is meant to either prepare, create, or resolve tension can have a big influence on how you choose to sing the melody over that chord. And being able to identify cadences will help you immensely when you're searching for a place to breathe in between phrases. As my teacher used to say, harmony means something, and comprehending harmonic function can help you unlock just what that something should be. Alright y'all, that's a wrap on today's video. I'll admit, we packed a lot about triads into this episode, so I really hope you'll take a moment to review and reflect on the topics we covered today. All of this content lines up with chapters 14 and 15 in our textbook, Music Fundamentals for Musical Theater, and I cannot stress enough how important it is that you take the time to practice the exercises found in those chapters. Let's briefly recap what we covered today before we take off. We opened things up with a discussion of diatonic triads, that special group of 7 chords that are built upon the notes of a major scale. In the second segment, we learned how to invert triads into new positions and then how to label them using slash chord symbols. And after the break, we learned more about harmonic progressions in tonal music, which led us to a discussion about harmonic function. In the next video, we're going to take everything from today and throw it in a blender. Maybe I'll reach out to NutriBullet and see about a sponsorship. Until next time, be kind to each other, and thanks for watching.